Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's John. It is November 17th, 2021, and I wanted to come to you this Wednesday afternoon with another book review. This is a review of a book that is pretty canonical in the subject matter. You see it mentioned a lot in syllabi, things like that. This is The Civilization of Europe in the Renaissance by John Hale. And apparently, according to the sticker there, I bought it at a half-price books, probably in San Antonio, in June of 2009 or slightly after that. So it has been stalking around my library waiting to be read for a dozen years. John Hale's book on the history of the European Renaissance belongs to, as I suggested, one of those relatively short lists of sort of indispensable books on the subject. It is extremely thorough. It is pretty important in the breadth and depth and sort of variety of subject that it covers. But it's also a little bit idiosyncratic in some ways. It's a topical history of the, roughly speaking, what we might call the long century, between approximately 1450 and 1620, that borrows from the French historiographical school called the Annales School of history writing. It borrows from that school the tradition of the Histoire des Mentalités, the sort of history of history written with the purpose of reconstructing the mental attitudes and intellectual frameworks and ideas that people actually had during the time period, instead of just telling you chronicles of events, major names, places, and dates. It tries to get into the heads and the mindsets of people living in the Renaissance. The title of the book also obviously acknowledges a debt to the intellectual tradition handed down by Jacob Burckhardt, the famous Swiss historian, whose Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy essentially cleared a pathway for future subjects, for future studies in Renaissance history. But whereas Burckhardt's book was one with the sole focus on Italian art and culture, Hale has taken the whole continent of Europe as his subject to look at the broader cosmopolitan picture of an emerging Europe. So this is evident even from the opening chapter, in which Hale takes up the ideas of self and other on a continent whose religious and philosophical conceptions of itself were, needless to say, rapidly shifting and eventually coalescing into somewhat cohesive portraits of themselves over time. When I say rapidly changing philosophical and religious pictures, just imagine this time period is when we have the Reformation. So that is a seismic shift in, well, for it. I mean, it changed religion. It changed Europe in essentially every single way, and in many ways, every single history of the Renaissance is in many ways a history of the Reformation. I don't think that's too much of an overstatement. From there, he goes and slowly talks about discussions of constructions and assumptions about national identity, which was, by the way, another not uncommon topic of the French Annales School, which I mentioned earlier. There are a few aspects of Hale's book that make it seem much older than its I think it's about 25 years old or so. First, Hale represents a pretty Whiggish version of Renaissance history that sees progress over time as inevitable. He also sidelines any interest in the discussion of or history of ordinary people, common people, preferring to discuss important people whose names are handed down in most other history books, like kings, diplomats, artists, philosophers, sculptors, composers, things like that. In fact, his running commentary on art is one of the notable parts of the book, as well as its numerous black and white reproductions of sculpture, painting, and architecture. And they're all over the book, by the way. They are also all in black and white, but I just wanted to share a few of them with you. There, I don't know how clear that is. That's Matthias Grunewald's Crucifixion from the Eisenheim Altarpiece. Let's see what else we can find in here. This is Veronese's the Feast at the House of Levy from 1573. Levi, excuse me. What on earth is wrong with me? Let's see, one more. Oh, everyone will recognize the betrothal of the Arnolfini by Jan van Eyck. It's a pretty universally recognized picture there. But there are dozens of really, really well reproduced black and white photos throughout the book. There are occasional stretches that can sometimes be a little bit dull, or that struck me as dull, or more oriented towards a reader who had more background in the particular thing that he was discussing than the average reader might have. Simply because of its scope, it certainly seems like it would be directed at someone who doesn't have a very broad exposure or deep exposure to the Renaissance. But some of the discussions do get very narrow and very deep. That's when I tended to lose interest. But for experts on a particular subject, if a particular artist or sculptor is a professional or scholarly interest, that would be fascinating to sort of excavate that little piece. For that reason, despite the sort of expansive and topical representation of the book, it's probably, at least for me, not the best introductory text or primer to the subject of the Renaissance. In many ways it is, but with the slight warning that some parts might need to be skipped. Despite being a survey covering, like I said, a vast array of information, Hale almost never sacrifices neither clarity nor detail. And this makes it a nearly fruitless book to review, despite me trying my absolute best to do so, because it's difficult to really know where to begin. What seems most important, what can understandably be left out, etc. I'll leave these decisions to other reviewers with maybe a better grasp of the period and relative importance of what should sort of sift to the forefront and what should be left in the background. I hope this is sort of an adequate explanation of the brevity and the overall impressionistic nature of this review. By far the biggest attraction of Hale's book is its scope. which succeeds in capturing the seismically important social and cultural changes that were associated with the European Renaissance. Hale's ability to successfully synthesize this amount of information speaks not only to the lifetime that he spent carefully curating and reading the original sources in, but equally to his dedication in seeing that his audience got a book that is an adequate reflection of his own learning and scholarship. The book is has a bit of a tragic side. I believe it was the last book that he ever wrote. And sometime during the writing of it, he suffered a very severe stroke, which left him without the ability to speak. And it was finished by, I think his wife sort of helped a team of scholars and his students cobble together the rest of what he was planning for it and finished it. But certainly a book that I would use as a guiding post to sort of learn about the Renaissance's picture of itself. I mean, I think the opening of the book, the first 100 or 200 pages where he talks about European sense of self and German and French and Italian sense of self, is really some of the most interesting parts of the book. So, The Civilization of Europe in the Renaissance by John Hale. If you've read it or have any opinions about it, please let me know in the comments. And otherwise, I will see everyone next week.